Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning into this episode. We are a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we really appreciate you listening, watching on YouTube. We really encourage you to subscribe to whatever platform you're using. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, or if you're on Apple or however you listen to a podcast, be sure and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it. Also, make comments if you like it and share it if you like it. We really need people to make comments and share the episodes that you like. And then also, if you're not already a supporter, we really would encourage you to go to spiritualityadventures.com and you can pick a tier, and we have bonus content for every type of giver. This is a nonprofit, so they're tax-deductible donations, but we do provide bonus content for those who are supporters. So be a part of the team, help support Spirituality Adventures, and we're so glad you're tuning into this episode. All right. Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for tuning into this episode. I'm excited to interview Liz Charlotte Grant today, and we've actually never met in person. I got a email from somebody who was like, "Hey, and I get these a lot, right? For the podcast, like people suggesting guests for me. But I haven't done very many of those. I usually interview people I know, but yours really caught my attention because of the genesis. And I saw you got some great book endorsements. She's got a new book out called Knock at the Sky. She's actually diving into the book of Genesis. And because of my background with the Hebrew Bible and all of that, I was like, "Oh, cool!" And she was taking a very unique approach. When I hear Pete Enns saying you got a good approach, and some of the other endorsements that you received, I was like, "Cool! I want to check this out." And I really enjoyed reading the book too. So, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, my endorsers are just very kind people, so I feel very grateful.
Yeah. I would love to get some of those endorsements on a book. That's really good stuff. Love it. Yeah. So let's first start with just give us a little bit about your origin story, your family background, how you grew up, your spiritual journey, what your family of origin was like when it came to faith and religious stuff. Give us some background.
Yeah, I grew up in white American evangelicalism. So I talk about that like my version of that, because, there are many versions of white American evangelicalism. Mine was very much Bill Hybels' kind of Costco replicable church planter variety of church. So the Costco variety is kind of what I think of it as like, because it's so replicable. It's like so easy to kind of pick up and put in a different community. Seeker sensitive, we didn't do much with theology. Like it was a pretty light exegesis on Sundays, let's say. If it was exegesis at all, it was more thematic preaching, it was that kind of thing. So I think I was a very curious kid, and I was involved in youth group, and I was going on all the mission trips and doing all the Bible studies. But, the Bible studies we were doing were like Christian bookstore, teen girl Bible studies with flowers on the cover, and that wasn't really my style. I mean, I found that really boring, just filling in the blanks, but I was very interested in the Bible. I kind of had I would say like a renewal experience when I was 13. I went to a navigators camp in Colorado, actually, a youth camp, and I had an experience with the Holy Spirit. I mean, that's kind of Fred, you're a little bit charismatic, so you get this. What I think probably now was a baptism of the Holy Spirit. I mean, I believed in Jesus, but I had an experience where I felt the presence of God with me for the first time. And that really shifted the way that I lived as a 13-year-old. I started not, not really dramatically shifting, but it changed some of my habits. I wanted to read the Bible for one. I wanted to pray, and I kept a prayer journal and all sorts of things that I was taught to do. But ultimately that was not satisfying for me. I like kept wanting more. I ended up at Wheaton College in the Chicago area, studied creative writing, and just about got a minor in Bible. I think I was a class or two short, but it was kind of a toss up between the two because I was so fascinated by the Bible. But frankly, didn't feel like there were jobs that existed for me. I think I wouldn't have told you it was because I was a woman, but that was definitely what it was. I mean, I just knew who was going to hire a female Bible scholar. Like there just like not that many places that I could have gone with that. So I think it felt more
not in the evangelical world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the
Yep.
evangelical world, there just was not a place for me, and that's what I was. I mean, I didn't consider anything else for a very long time.
What year
So
were you at Wheaton?
I graduated 2009. No, is that right? I think that's right. Yeah, 2009 was my class.
What was your major?
Creative writing, so English literature and creative writing.
But you were diving into theology stuff as well, like kind of
Yeah, I was taking
like
extra
everything.
classes,
Mhm.
and everybody at Wheaton has to take quite a few. But I was adding on like upper level classes on Jeremiah, just for fun.
Did you study with John Walton ever?
You know what? I'm trying to remember. I
Just
do know of John. I do know of John, and he and I have corresponded just a little bit, but I don't think I ended up having a class with him,
okay.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I know several Wheaton grads that were hanging out with you around that time.
Oh, that's fun.
One of the guys, um, Shadid, his dad's a orthopedic surgeon in Chicago. I think he would be
Okay.
right. Anyway, Andrew is his name, but he had a whole crew of friends, and a lot of them kind of deconstructed and stuff together.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, yeah. All right. So where'd you go from Wheaton?
Mm.
Because you had a basically
Yeah.
in the front, your intro in your book, you've gone through some kind of rethinking your faith in a pretty serious way.
Mm-hmm.
What led to that?
I think it was family upbringing mostly. I grew up evangelical, but um, in a dysfunctional family. And so I had a lot of kind of pain and unresolved trauma from that. So actually, my last semester of college, I ended up in the counseling center's, a free therapy session just in front of a grad student. And I just would pour my heart out to her. This was probably the last couple of months of my time at Wheaton. Um, and she would just sit and listen to me. And thinking back on it now, I think that was the first moment I felt pastored. Um, Having grown up in evangelical spaces, there wasn't really a way for me to be pastored like that with kind of presence and openness and someone really meeting me in whatever pain I was kind of walking through at the time. Um, and I think for me that was really transformational. I started in more therapy after college, and did that through most of my 20s. Was in and out of therapy for about a decade, just trying to work through things from my childhood and generational kind of history of trauma. Um, and that was really huge for me. I think realizing that I was finding this help outside of the church, and that it wasn't separate from the church. It really was not. And I started reading the Bible differently. I think because of that, I started to see ways that God in God's nature created space for boundaries, for example, for individuation, um, for free will, for ways to kind of think and feel that I hadn't learned in evangelical spaces. I started to kind of understand more deeply the experience of really walking with Jesus, and it didn't look primarily evangelical. And so that was part of it for me. I think also, I had some pain in different churches that we were a part of. We were part of an Acts 29 church. I was an intern at that church as a 30-something woman. And that was complicated.
Where was that at, by the way?
It was in Denver.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that was very complicated.
Pre-Mark Driscoll, post-Mark Driscoll years in the
Pre.
29. Before Mark had become Acts 29.
Well, he was involved. Yeah. So it was still his organization at the time.
Okay.
But he hadn't had his big fall.
Okay.
And it was, well, I'm trying to remember. It was before Rise and Fall of Mars Hill at the very least. But so there was some awareness of narcissism when we were there. There was some awareness that maybe the founder of that church had struggled in similar ways as Mark. But there was a lot of unhealthy dynamics kind of behind closed doors that I hadn't realized when I entered the staff to work for free 20 hours a week. So it was complicated. It was really complicated. I'm not afraid of conflict. So that was a eye-opening experience for everybody, probably. Anyway, but I think I ended up leaving that church with a lot of pain and uncertainty about kind of how I would be involved in church. I joined an ACNA church with my husband after that, in our family, Anglican Church in North America. And they're also going through lots of changes. And there was some kind of interpersonal stuff there that was really challenging. So I started noticing these patterns within these evangelical spaces. I kept thinking I was getting away from evangelicalism in different modes, and really just kept being chased by this specter. Eventually now I'm at a PCUSA church. So I just kind of I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I can't fix this beast. But I think for a long time, really, really wanted, even though I disagreed with much of the theology and kind of how it worked out. I believe I'm Orthodox based on the creeds, but the way that it works out, does not always look like the creeds. So I think I, for a long time, felt a responsibility and a desire to be involved in kind of undermining and changing the evangelical church, and finally realized this is not my fight anymore. So just sort of had to release that to God and say, church might not be that for me anymore. Maybe I need to actually just sit and learn and be. So that's kind of the place I find myself now. It's been a complex journey. I mean, becoming radicalized in politics doesn't help, to keep one in evangelicalism. So there you go.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Pretty tight box there. Well, you started writing, and I noticed in some of the email that you sent me, you've received some awards for your blog. What's your what do you call your blog that you do, and when did you start writing and putting out some of this stuff that's inside you? When did you start doing that?
Yeah, I actually write a newsletter, and it's a Substack, so it also has a blog presence. It's called The Empathy List, and I've been doing that for probably 5 years now. So that's been an ongoing project, just trying to refine voice and things like that. But I've been publishing for the past probably 12 years, publishing my work, just in various places that would have it first for free, and then, branching out into other places and kind of finding an audience in more progressive Christian spaces. And so, there was kind of I would say there was like a culture shock for me leaving college, because there's a sense in a liberal arts institution that like you can just study things that you want. They don't actually have to be applicable to real life. And so, I learned this whole creative writing degree, and I learned how to write, and I learned how to critique. I had no idea how to do the business side of writing. And so that was a learning experience for me over many years to try to figure that out. So I think, the newsletter has been part of that for me. It's sort of a Christian left storytelling take on news and all sorts of stuff. I mean, right now I'm doing a series on, my husband and I recorded a podcast related to the making of this book. So an artistic kind of following the artistic process of collaboration between us. But yeah, it's just kind of a place where I can be a little more casual about my thoughts around, I don't have to write a big long essay. I can kind of put things out weekly and just have a rhythm where I'm kind of in touch with people and thinking through things. That's really good for me. I've found.
Good. Cool. Let's jump into your book, Knock at the Sky. And, why did you pick Genesis and dive into Genesis this is your first book, right? First book. Okay. Yeah. So you first publish a book on Genesis.
Yeah.
You're moving from evangelical space to progressive Christian space. And then all of a sudden you tackle Genesis.
Yeah. Great question. I mean, first of all, why did you study the Hebrew Bible? We can talk about that later.
I'm just a nerd at heart.
There you go. That's probably why I did. But yeah. I think the fact is, I kind of stumbled on it by accident, which is funny because I wanted to write about the prophets, which will be in my next project. But I got really interested in this question of God's voice and kind of wanted to trace back, where does the voice of God come up first? Of course, it's Genesis 1:1, right? And I started writing about that and started just getting really interested in this question of, how does God speak with no throat? How does God even make noise without a container? That just by itself defies physics. And why, by the way, would God even need to make sound? Like, why would the Hebrew writers represent God as making sound at the beginning if there's no one to hear it? Right. So there are all sorts of kind of questions around that for me, which was really interesting and a different way of approaching it than I knew other people had done. I happened to be at a residency when I was just getting started writing this, a writing residency. And so I had people reading my early draft, and they were really compelled. And I was like, I don't know, maybe there's something here. So I think I didn't realize probably how hard it would be, first of all, or how challenging it would be to publish a book like this. That's a whole other story. But I ended up,
by the way, because I ended up not getting the physical copy. I ended up just,
oh no,
I went through the Kindle, I downloaded on Kindle, and so who published it? I forgot.
Eerdmans published it. So they are, they're, mostly theological press, but they are starting kind of a trade arm. And this was kind of part of that, an acquisition toward that. But I think, the way that I write is very lyrical and poetic. And I wrote this kind of commentary on Genesis 1 to 32, but it's in a very midrashic style. Creative nonfiction writers call it like a braided essay style. So it's like I just braid a whole bunch of different pieces together. Might be more accurate to call it like a collage at this point. But I write about science, origin stories from science, from the fine arts. I bring a lot of metaphor into my exploration of the scriptures. And then I bring a lot of Jewish midrash in as well, and just do a lot of storytelling. I mean, my goal was just to tell stories and to give you to give readers a new imagination for approaching this ancient text. One that's different than, I wanted to give different questions. I didn't want it to be just a weapon of the culture wars. Did this happen in 7 days or not?
Yeah.
I think that's a boring question. I want to know something else. And so I wanted to ask other questions.
And it's not the question that the text intends to raise either. So anyway, it's a weird modern approach to the text that even native to the text itself, right? So, so a couple of things taught, just your approach. So your method, you call it, right? And I love some of the thoughts that you laid out there, right, in that first piece there on method. Two things that stood out to me. One was you decided not to you decided to explore these texts from people who have written on it from the margins versus your mainstream white dudes. There's a few white dudes in there. You quote Brueggemann and Heschel and a few people, but you tried to avoid the sort of the people that you'd grown up on, right? And you tried to seek out the voices from the margins. That's one thing I noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to read
some
the
of
Womanists.
some of the people that you just give us some of the people that you were referencing from the margins.
Yeah. So from the margins, I wanted to, like you said, I just wanted to learn. I didn't know their voices before, and I needed these other takes, like I needed another way to read the scriptures. So, I spent a lot of time with womanist theologians. So, Wilda Gaffney is a great source for that. Dolores S. Williams, Dr. Williams, wrote a phenomenal work on Hagar that really launched womanism. And it's called Sisters in the Wilderness. I was just transfixed by that book. Phyllis Tribble's work, Texts of Terror, was fascinating. There's several of these kind of commentaries that were just totally different. And then I read some disability commentaries. I read some, I did a lot of work in the liberation space to try to I brought on James Cone and just tried to bring a lot of other voices to bear. Yeah. Howard Thurman. My goal was not to be.
You went back to some of the old rabbis too,
Yeah.
Some of the rabbinics.
Yeah. Yeah. And I didn't want to be comprehensive. I knew that I couldn't be, like, that's not what this work was trying to be. It was really just trying to kind of offer windows of insight from other places. And so to the best that I could do that, with the knowledge that I have and the time I had to research and things like that, I wanted to be faithful to these different movements and represent them as best as I could.
Excellent. And tell us, for those who are listening, what the heck is midrash, and what are the two types of midrash that you bring up, and why was that important for you to follow that? And then you get into this isn't really exegesis. I'm going to do eisegesis, And what do you see the value of that? Why take an eisegesis approach, which is quite opposite of how we were raised in evangelicalism? If you do eisegesis, you can make the thing say whatever you want it to say, right? And so you got, but the text, as you paint it out, is this artistic fabric kind of does that to us anyway, if we allow it to, right? So
Hmm.
what's midrash to you, the two types, and how did that lead you into this approach?
Yeah, well, I will actually pull up that chapter again for myself to make sure I get the two types right. Um, because I am not a midrashic scholar, folks. I have not been to seminary. I am a learner. But I found a lot of inspiration in the midrashic style of conversation with the text, which allows a lot of imagining, a lot of engagement with even the white spaces in the text. So the places that we don't have information, why did Abraham pick up his rugs and walk into the desert? We don't know. The text doesn't tell us, right? Well, the rabbis have a lot of thoughts about that.
Isn't it
So
fascinating?
many.
They'll have dozens and dozens and dozens of thoughts on the things that aren't even in the text, right? It's so
Yeah.
fascinating.
But I think that's just so human, right? Like we're engaging a story. Of course, we're going to imagine backstory, right? And one of the things that I found so interesting is I don't think I had ever heard people talk about how kind of midrashic sources view the authority of scripture. That was a question that I think evangelicals often have when they're thinking about, if we read a text a different way, well, does it lose authority over our lives? Does it, is God okay with that? And will we become bad people if we start reading like that? I think it was really interesting to note
Yeah,
that.
crazy thing though. It's in my opinion, like I've gotten where I don't even like the term authority anymore.
Mhm.
It's to the text because what happens in evangelical circles and other circles is that like you have to lose your own agency in order to submit to this outside authority when I think and so like okay, so you have no agency now and you just have to obey this outside authority. And I just think that it's first of all, it does abuse to, I think, what the text is trying to do, but then it does abuse to personhood, I think, as well. If you think through how that then begins to, oh, well, then, well, who's the authoritative person to tell you what this text says and how you need to lead? It's usually a white dude, right? So anyway,
It
yeah,
is. It is. I totally agree with you. Yeah, I was fascinated to find that. I mean, in the word authority is the word author, right? So it's kind of related to like what does it mean? What is the intention? And I think that gave me some freedom personally, but you know, I'm kind of allergic to hierarchy myself. But you had asked kind of what the two types of midrash are. Midrash halakha, you probably could say that better than me. Halakhic midrash um, explains explicit precepts or guidelines for conducting one's life in accordance with God's mandate. So that's legal codes, right? Like that is the law as we think about it in the Old Testament. And then there's midrash Haggadah or Agadic midrash. That is the sort of explanatory. I think of it honestly as an illumination, like the monks would illuminate manuscripts with gold leaf and with cursive and with illustration. I think about Haggadic midrash like that. Um, so it is explanatory. Even that last one is explanatory, but it allows for expansive additions. It allows for anecdotes and legends and all that to kind of get mixed into the exegesis. So, and I found it says common to both categories. This is from Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, another source that I found invaluable. Very much recommend her midrashic takes on the scriptures. So she writes, common to both categories is its bibliocentric basis. Midrash necessarily presupposes the concept of an authoritative text. So the authority is not up for debate. The fact is that they believe this word is so authoritative that they want to get every kind of nuance they possibly can out of it. They want to be fed by this text. So when I talk about kind of eisegesis, you know, the it's often described like, you know, what you said for Fred, like you can read whatever you want into it. It's just like personal. It doesn't mean anything. You just kind of spout off, right, about the Bible. Well, by the way, plenty of exegetes do that. First of all. So just to point that out. But also, I would say one of the things I found so fascinating about how Zornberg understands eisegesis is she sees it as a more like dialectic and rhetorical approach. So rather than trying to approach entirely personally, she's bringing other texts to bear. So in Zornberg's case, she's reading Genesis and she's bringing in Carl Jung and she's bringing in all sorts of kind of other psychologists and she's bringing in literature and she's bringing in all sorts of other things, not to diminish the text, but to try to understand more deeply and as a human, you know, in a very human way, because we all do that, right? We all have our own perception we bring to the text, our own expertise. Of course we do, right? Like a doctor is going to read stories of healing differently in the Bible. We understand that, but I think we often feel like that's not a legitimate reading. And I think eisegesis actually gives permission to say, you can bring yourself to this text and it can speak to you. God can speak to you in your personhood in all the ways that you are unique. You know, this text can continue to speak. And I think that's just what literature does. All literature, but especially this one.
I love that. I love seeing it as art, a tapestry, and you can immerse yourself in it. And there are so many different imaginative readings and subversive readings and, you know, plain readings, and there's just so many ways to read the text. So I love it. Thanks for, yeah, I thought you did a great job of just laying that out. So your first chapter, I really loved the first chapter, First Contact. And, you know, you have this tohu vabohu, right? That's the empty and void, you know, the spirits hovering over the deep, right? And you bring out some wonderful insights into the deep and silence and whale songs. I loved what together. Like, first of all, just the whale song stuff, the history of that was so fascinating to me. Like, I didn't know that history of how these guys discovered whale songs, you know. And then I thought that was so fascinating the way you connected that to this this opening couple of verses in Genesis. When God began to create, some people translate it as when, that bait of they call it's a different, you know, in the beginning, that initial little word there can be translated when God began to create the heavens and the earth, you know, then you got this spirit hovering over the deep, and it's tohu vabohu. It's poetry already, right? As that empty and void kind of stuff. So talk about your find on silence, and then this whole book is kind of digging into this how do we hear God kind of concept, and you open up with silence and whale songs. So I thought that was fascinating. God speaks,
Yeah.
first silence and whale song. How does that
Yeah.
give us some insight into that as you opened it up?
Yeah. Well, I think I got to go back to Zornberg here again. This was her insight first. But one of the things she talks about is this phrase, the murmuring deep. She kind of brings out some of the linguistic connotations. How do you say the murmuring deep in Hebrew? Because I'm saying it wrong, I'm sure.
Isn't it Tehom?
Yeah. That's how I would say it, but I'm not sure if I did it right.
Yeah.
So Tehom is this word that is often translated the murmuring deep, the watery abyss. It's whatever God's spirit is hovering over initially. And there's all sorts of stuff that I've heard about that in the past. God is hovering like a mother hen hovers over her eggs, for example. But the insight that really blew my mind was this idea of these connotations. So Tehom can also mean murmuring. It can mean humming. It can mean cooing. It can mean panic or stirring. It has all of these kind of echoes of pre-linguistic sort of sounds, like the sounds an infant makes, the confusion of kind of pre-consciousness. You kind of get a sense of total chaos here, right? That God is kind of entering into this chaos. And one of the things that Zornberg's and somebody else that she quotes talks about is that in order to create, God actually first, in order to create with speech, God first had to create silence. So God's first creative act actually was to make space for God's own voice. So the silence is God setting the table. So the idea is kind of God enters, creates silence, and then speaks. And out of God's mouth then unfurls the cosmos, right? So for me, that was really compelling. And I also, in this chapter, was thinking a lot about God's voice as alien. Like you said, I named it the chapter First Contact. And I think one of the questions that came up for me was, God speaks in a way that's totally different than us, right? Like if God has no container that can hold a sound and project a sound and make a sound, then God is speaking a totally different way. And so what other creatures on our planet speak in a way that is totally different than we speak? And it turns out it's whales. So whales actually speak by recycling air within their guts. It's not like a belch, it's intentional. It's like real. My editor was like, so is it whale song just gas? And I was like, no. It's definitely intentional. They are definitely singing and communicating, but it's just different than we do. It's totally different. They have tons of chambers kind of in their internal guts, and the air just goes in and out. Sort of like bagpipes, sort of like, maybe like a reeded instrument. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can kind of think of to get the idea of whale song and how it works. But I think one of the things that most fascinated me was that we don't know why whales sing.
I love that.
We don't actually know. We thought maybe it was mating, but they sing outside of mating season. They like gather off every year. There's like a whale karaoke lounge that gathers off the coast of Indonesia. All these young humpback whales gather together and they sing together. And it's like I think of it as their little Burning Man, like whale Burning Man. They're all gathering together and singing and passing each other songs. And so scientists will hear the same song repeated in different oceans from different whales, like they're kind of listening to the radio together. It's just wild. But I think for me, it was really important to think of God in this totally other way. What was a way that I could kind of create a new metaphor for the God who speaks the world into existence? What does that actually look like when I'm not anthropomorphizing? I'm actually putting it on an animal, right? Like, and that's a totally different, and an alien animal on our planet, probably one of the most alien animals to us. They have their own cultures, their own language that we don't understand. We don't even understand how it works. And so I think for me, that became a really compelling way to think about God in this sort of primordial space, as God is hovering, as God is making and proclaiming goodness and breathing God's own breath into the muddy human creature. I think I just needed this totally different frame of reference, and Wales became that to me.
I love that. That's so cool. Um, And it's poetic. These opening verses of Genesis are very much Hebrew poetry. You can hear it in the tohu vabohu, the empty and void, but then it continues, right? And so I've often said, it's almost like God singing creation into like 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 anyway, it's fascinating.
I'm with you.
So I like the whale song thing. That was cool. You chapter 2, you talk about the plural of let us make God in our own image. And of course, all the different ideas about, well, what the heck why is God plural all of a sudden, right? And what's fast, the main word for God there in Genesis, the opening verse, is Elohim, which is plural. That's a Hebrew word for God that's plural, right? The im ending is plural. So even you could, in the beginning, God's created the heaven and earth. Then you go, oh, there's only one God, so then the Hebrew people, but where were you going with bringing this out? I thought when you quoted Abraham Joshua Heschel, God's dream is to basically co-partner with creation in creating. Is that so? And then how does that tie into the voice of God? I thought that was I like that chapter 2 as well. Talk about the plural. What is that about? This let us create God. Us.
Yeah, I the question I really wanted to ask was, I think that's the one too with the pool. Let me just check. It's funny when you write a book and then you forget parts of it and you have to kind of check back. What did I say actually?
Right.
I actually start that one with a story of me standing at the edge of a pool and noticing my body having changed, because I'm asking this question about being image bearers as well. And I think one of the things that the rabbis were really interested in this question. I actually tell this story later on in the book, but there's this legend that Moses is talking with God and writing down the Torah, and they get to this verse, let us make. And Moses objects and says, God, why give the heretics room to imagine that there are multiples, basically? Why give room for heretics here? And God says, let me see if I can get it right. Let him who errs, I think it's he who wishes to err, let him err. And so there's this sense where God, knowing that we could misunderstand, or that the Jews could misunderstand, actually gives a permission slip here. And this is a legend, but I think I see this in the scriptures too, this sense of kind of freedom where we can kind of play with this. So I think this passage, of course, so many people, and, as Christians, we read this and we're like, oh, Trinity. That's the first, clear instance of the Trinity, right? Let us make. God is talking to God's self. But I think it's interesting to think about it in terms of kind of God's internal language, God kind of thinking out loud and giving us a glimpse into that. That's kind of another theory of the rabbis, is that God is actually showing us how to be a host, modeling collaboration. There are all sorts of other theories about this. I tend to kind of hold any of my own conclusions pretty loosely because I'm not a scholar, number one, but also because I think the text is so complex and we all have really interesting ideas that we can bring to it. This was kind of part of the reason I wanted to bring so many marginal voices to the table. I wanted to be able to have so many voices speaking. And that's kind of part of this too, right? God, this collaborative effort makes humankind. And then, Adam realizes that he's alone and God makes a partner. There's this like continual kind of expansion of this collaborative effort. Even the naming is a version of kind of joining God in the creative work, right? Because we are extending and explaining creation and all that stuff. But I find it really fascinating. And even having made Adam without a partner in the Garden of Eden, in paradise, and Adam has this moment of feeling his lack and desire and absence in the Garden of Eden, realizes he doesn't have a pair because he's pairing all these animals. And my theory is kind of God like put him up to it so that he would realize that he wasn't like them and he should be like them. And so then this is the first chance that God has to meet the human's need. And again, we see a collaboration occurring here, right? Where the human need meets God's abundance and God provides a partner. And this is the pattern over and over that you kind of see in these creation narratives. Over and over, God is creating and offering and hosting and creating this abundant world for us, which, is just gift.
That's awesome. I love that. I mean, the idea that, in the open relational process theology crowd, we're always talking about God doesn't act just unilaterally hierarchical from top down on this sort of objective, whatever it is, but it's always a co-partnership and a co-creation. God is always partnering to co-create everything from the beginning till now and into the future. That's the way God moves and works, is in co-partnering, co-creating with all of creation. I love that. I want to cover a couple more things. We've got about 15 more minutes. I'm going to pull out the first one on your chapter, White Noise. I thought it was so fascinating because this overarching theme of how do you hear the voice of God and how does that happen? And in your chapter, White Noise, you talk about the voices in the mind. I share a little of your thoughts around that idea of, like hearing God objectively almost outside of yourself versus almost like Abraham's own thoughts became the voice of God kind of thing.
Yeah, mind. There's a theory by a Yale psychologist, Julian Jaynes, and Dr. Jaynes hypothesizes that early man, like in the Iron Age, like Abraham, would have heard and understood, would have had kind of a different mode of consciousness, let's say. So there would have been a split between kind of an interior perspective of the mind and kind of an exterior perspective. And so the idea is that there's kind of a split there, and that early man could not tell the difference between his own voice and the voice of God. And so Dr. Jaynes' theory is that, like in the case of Abraham here, when God speaks to him, he is actually interpreting his own voice, his own interior monologue, as the voice of God. I spent some time like thinking through that because I found it really fascinating that somebody spent time to think through this too. Like I would, and I was like, I love this. I want to spend time here. I ultimately disagree because there are plenty of times when Abraham and other characters disagree with God, right? Like just written down in the text. Mm-hmm. So even, and Jaynes might have other theories for that too, right? But I think part of the thing that makes Abraham interesting is that he listens. and he obeys and he goes, right? And so I think some of that kind of breaks down for me. I kind of see it as some chronological snobbery because I'm like, no, early humans couldn't have been like us. We now are higher brain development. I'm like, okay, well, says who, and we have evidence that 37,000 years ago, people were drawing in caves and having spiritual experiences, and they drew with perspective, and so I'm kind of like, I think it's kind of tempting for us to think that even a few thousand years ago, those little dummies, like they couldn't even recognize the difference between themselves and God. But I think it's more interesting to me. And I don't spend much time on the historicity. So I kind of just like go with the story. So I'm willing to say, yeah, Abraham heard from God. And that's like not an issue for me because I'm willing to kind of jump into the story just as a stream and surrender to the narrative. And so, it doesn't bother me in the least. I'm not going, scientifically, how did this happen? But I think it's an interesting question and interesting to think about, were there different ways of understanding the voice of God, and how would they have even encountered God? A big part of why Genesis is interesting to me is it's all these very early encounters of humanity with divinity. And they have all sorts of ways of describing that. And, fundamentally it is, people several centuries removed writing about those inherited stories, right? And so these are ancestral stories handed down of experiences with God that I just find really fascinating. And I think this is just another case of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I like the way you continually, the multiple voices, even collective authorship, and even like the voices disagreeing with each other, and all of the humanity of having a real relationship is alive and in the text itself, in this dynamic interrelationship with divinity and humanity and the voices and God's voice and our voice, and you know and sometimes humanity's voice is pushing back against God's voice, and God's voice is pushing back against humanity's voice, and all of those. It's so, I like the way you continue to bring out that plurality of voices through this text. So there's so much more to talk about, but you landed toward the end chapters. You start diving into the Hagar story really deeply, and I think the perspective that you're bringing out is one that, well, I never heard it in the evangelical world, right? So let's close out with some of the thoughts on the Hagar, and then maybe, yeah, and kind of land us with some of those insights that you're bringing in, and
Yeah.
some of the people you've referenced are bringing into that story.
Yeah. Dr. Williams is the main one who sort of led me down the path for this. She wrote Sisters in the Wilderness, which is about Hagar almost exclusively. It's about her experience in the household of Abraham, kind of being cast out of the house, also running away from the house. And there's kind of a whole kind of strand that she connects to the experience of Black American women, African American women. She sees in Hagar the experience of African American women, the experience of kind of being abused, of being overlooked, of their bodies being misused, of enslavement and misuse and all these things. So, but then she sees God seeing Hagar and attending to Hagar. And there's, of course, an annunciation in the desert and all sorts of stuff. So, but for those kind of unfamiliar with the story, I mean, I'm guessing your folks are very, very familiar with the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, but
yeah, some people would be, some people wouldn't be, but yeah.
Yeah.
Help us out a little bit.
The broad strokes are Abraham and Sarah are promised a son and a lineage when Abraham leaves his father's house. And so they kind of set out on this venture, assuming that Sarah will become pregnant. They don't have any heirs, they're infertile. And so it's kind of a leap of faith there, right? And they head out, and then they settle in Canaan eventually, and they're there for 10 years, and Sarah still has not conceived. And she just so happens to have this enslaved woman in her household, Hagar, who is able to conceive, apparently. And Sarah, kind of in the custom of the day, which, was surrogacy was very much a custom, especially for a person who owned another person, to kind of volunteer them for the role. And so Sarah says, take my slave woman, Hagar, Abraham, sleep with her, get her pregnant, and that will be our son. That will be our heir. So it goes exactly like that. There's no protest from the patriarch. And she becomes pregnant, has a son, that's Ishmael. From Ishmael come the Ishmaelites, and then kind of the Arab nation and Muslim and Islam, etc. But what's interesting is that there is ongoing conflict in this household. I mean, you kind of expect it just among normal people when there's two wives and one husband, basically. There's different kind of theories about whether Hagar is a wife or not, but the fact is that she was able to conceive a son for this man, and that is a big deal in the ancient Near East. And so infertility was considered almost a disability at that time. And so, I mean, some would argue that it is still kind of considered that, which I hope not, but I can understand kind of that feeling. And so I think, from there, the story sort of devolves. Sarah starts mistreating Hagar, so much so that Hagar runs away. And Dr. Williams describes this as the first instance of a woman, of someone liberating themselves in literature, really, but in the Bible in particular. And so Hagar runs off. She's pregnant. I don't think she probably knows she's pregnant at this time. She runs into the Egyptian desert, and this is a vast and dry and hot region, as you would imagine most deserts are. And she runs off pregnant, and the desert is not a place for a pregnant body. And God actually meets her. She comes to a well, which you can imagine that would have been dangerous for her as a slave running away. So that kind of gives you a sense of her desperation at that point. She's that thirsty. So she comes to this well. The angel of God meets her and says, Hagar, I've seen you. And it's an annunciation scene. Like, it is a scene in which the angel says, you're going to have this baby. This baby will give you a heritage. And your salvation will come from this child. And she accepts that.
Mary's like an echo of that, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And actually, it's in the text in that place that it's located, it is an echo of Abraham's call, which is really interesting. We don't normally hear it preached like that. But God tells her to return to her enslavement, and then she will receive all this stuff. I read that and have such a hard time hearing that as good news. I just don't. I feel like God is being unjust. I can't believe that God would send her back. And I truly still deeply struggle with that. Why would God send her back into her enslavement? But one of the things that Dr. Williams says is, again, a pregnant body is not fit for the desert. The desert is dangerous to her. And in fact, the only way that she will is if she returns and has the son. Yeah. So she comes back. And God, by the way, is the first to use her name in the whole narrative. So no one calls her Hagar until God calls her Hagar. So Abraham and Sarah call her the slave, the woman, the slave woman, my servant, etc. They don't use her name, which again is very indicative of kind of the type of culture in their household toward her. And so she goes back, she has the son. There's jealousy. Eventually, Sarah's pregnant miraculously, and that's a whole other story. And there's kind of infighting between the two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and Ishmael and Hagar are thrown out of the house. And there's a sense that like they now will die in the desert. You know, Abraham sends them off with like the famous paintings are like, you know, a single jar of water and a tiny bag of food. And you just have this sense they are going to die here. You know, there's no, even Abraham thinks so, even though God tells him, I'll take care of them. You know, they walk out into the desert. You're like, they're goners. And they reach that point in the narrative. Hagar puts down her child. We don't know how old he was, but let's say he's a child that she could carry. And she sets him down under a bush and walks away because she doesn't watch him die. And God appears again and provides a spring, like water in the desert where there was no water. And water in a desert climate is wealth. It is survival, right? And so Dr. Williams says, you know, this is what God has always done. God provides a way where there was no way. There are resources where there should be no resources. And God provides for Hagar and Ishmael, and they become the Arab people. So anyway, that's kind of the overview. I go into it in a lot of depth, but yeah, that's kind of a good overview, I think.
So fascinating. You know, when you were talking about her going back into slavery, you know, when I first got into pastoral ministry and would encounter like a wife who was being physically abused or emotionally abused by a husband, you know, I was just like, so I didn't understand what she was actually going through. And so I was like, well, leave, you know, like get out of there, you know. But eventually we started a domestic violence ministry that were led by women who had been through it. And many, many times, if you just leave, it actually puts your life at risks even more so. Like these abusers can kill you. You know what I mean? If you try to resist the wrong way, it can mean your death, right? So we started working a whole team of people with women who had been through it, who then could help other people, help other women move through those stages safely. Yeah, so it's, you know, it's so interesting to hear readings of the text that you would have never heard that reading in an evangelical church, right? And yet it brings a whole new dimension to thinking through a text. And I think you do that consistently, you know, with every one of your chapters, you're bringing a whole new dimension. But then I love how the overarching, maybe land us for just give us some of your overarching thoughts that you were wanting to, and we'll kind of land there, and then we need to kind of wrap it up here. But give us your land, you know, kind of overarching theme, and then we'll land with your website, book.
Yeah, great.
Read it and get it, that kind of thing, hopefully. So
yeah. I think one of the things I took away from this project was just how much of a literary masterwork the Bible really is. I spent quite a bit of time thinking about how the Bible was made physically and passed from hand to hand so that it could get to us, including kind of translation and even translation errors. You know, I actually see this kind of trend of translation errors kind of coming to light, by the way, as hopeful, because the Spirit of God is still speaking to us and we can still see them as errors and we can correct them. And so one of my kind of hypothesis, you know, one of the thesis statements of the whole work is that God is still speaking, God is still acting, and God acts through God's people. And it's a collaborative effort to kind of understand God and understand God's book. But it must be collaborative or we won't have the whole picture. So I think for me, it was important to sort of decenter my own thoughts. So I have just so many different scholars that I kind of quote in the pages, and it just felt like a huge research project. I have like over 300 endnotes. And so I was really trying to give a pretty good overview, but to do it in a way that mirrored kind of this new sort of interpretative mode that I would encourage folks toward, which is a collaborative mode that really takes seriously the experiences of our life as we engage the text, and of each of our lives, not just mine individually, but a collaborative kind of longer table where we invite people to sit down and share really openly and honestly about how the text hits them. But I do think the text still speaks to us. I believe in the Spirit of God still at work and still speaking because I see it, in the way that we are continuing to return over and over to this text and find truth and find God. And so I wasn't willing to kind of give up these stories. And I really hope that this work encourages folks to do the same, to be tenacious with God's words, tenacious with interpretation, and tenacious with community, as we expand the table and start to really listen and hear and decenter ourselves.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Thanks for being on Spirituality Adventures. Tell us your website. By the way, your book's on Amazon. Or however people get your book, but what's your website?
I'm just at lizcharlotte.com. So really easy. My newsletter, that's probably the best way to connect with me. That is theempathylist.com. And that's actually just one E. So thempathylist. That was actually a mistake, but it works. It's fine.
Okay.
And I'm on Threads. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, but I think I put my best work and self on my newsletter. So
cool. Liz Charlotte Grant, the new book is here, Knock at the Sky, and check out her newsletter as well, The Empathy List. So, all right, folks, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being with us, Liz. And what's the weather doing in Denver? I know our listeners will be after the point, but we're getting a whole storm rolling in on us, Kansas City, I guess, that just rolled through your world.
I think we're on the back end of that, but I think we might have snow coming. So we'll see.
We're on the front end of it. So yeah.
Good luck to you.
Right. Well, thanks so much. Have a great day. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.
Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening all the way through on this episode. By the way, if you're not already a supporter, go to spiritualityadventures.com, sign up for one of our monthly supports, and you will receive our bonus content. You'll receive lots of interesting information about our guests. Many of our musicians will do special bonus songs and record a song. So I want to encourage you to do that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Be sure and subscribe. Be sure and share any of the episodes that you like. And be sure and make comments if you like them as well. This helps us get Spirituality Adventures out there to more listeners, more watchers. So whatever platform you're using, subscribe, like, share, make comments, and go to our website, sign up for our team, and be a part of the team support. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.